Chapter 3. Annabel gasped as she awoke. She was breathing raggedly, and her body ached all over. She faintly remembered an explosion, and then a white light, but now there was only darkness. She blinked, forcing her eyes to focus. She saw the sky, space, the stars. It was a beautiful sight. Unfortunately, the smell was not so pleasant. It smelled of rotten eggs. That was the closest thing she could liken it to. She groaned and sat up, and saw that she was in a small rocky crevice, like a ditch. Sat nearby, with his back to her, was Commander Bolt. She looked around, but couldn't see Max. "Commander?" she said quietly. Bolt stirred. She noted he had fallen asleep. She wondered how long he had been keeping watch. Was he guarding her? He had always had an overdeveloped sense of honor and chivalry. She told him she found it tiresome, but really she found it rather flattering. Andrew turned to her with tired eyes and bloodstains on his forehead. "Anna, how are you feeling?" he asked. There was he, blood all over him, and he was asking after her. She thought back to when the pair of them had been partying hard on Waxan. Their squad had quelled the insurgency, and that night they had all celebrated like the next day would be their last. This was the most groggy she had been since then. "I've been better. You don't look so hot either," she remarked. "I've had worse," Bolt said dismissively. "They crippled our ship. There wasn't much else we could do but crash. We're surprisingly undamaged, considering." "This planetoid has air?" Anna asked incredulously. She stood up and noticed a light-headed feeling. She rubbed her forehead. "That's not concussion," Bolt remarked, "although you may have one of those too. But the gravity here is less than we're used to, so everything seems faster and easier here. I think that's why the crash wasn't so bad. Gave us a little less heft. The air, surprisingly, is breathable." "But it stinks," Anna replied. "Yeah, that too." "Where's Max?" she asked. Bolt looked to the ground. "Gone. The ship was torn apart. We lost him." "Poor guy. He didn't deserve that. For that matter, neither do we. What are we going to do?" "I'll level with you. I don't know. We're in as bad a situation as it gets. We're stranded on an unidentified planetoid with no supplies, and worse, the ones who shot us down are here too. I managed to carry you here, where I figured they may not notice us. At least not right away," Bolt said. Anna felt her eyes prickling. She didn't want to cry, but the thought of Max's death and the fact that they were probably going to die soon made her not a little emotional. She wished there was some way, any way, to get out of this alive. The Dalek saucer had landed securely on the largest flat surface they could detect. Ryuk had done his homework and scanned the atmosphere. High sulfur content, but it was surprisingly breathable, so he didn't need a helmet. However, once he had descended the landing ramp and inhaled the stale, smelly air, he thought about turning back to fetch it. Lex descended behind him. Ryuk turned to look at him. "You know, sometimes I envy you. Not having noses can be quite handy sometimes," Ryuk said flippantly. Lex's eye looked at him blankly.
"Daleks have olfactory senses, General. I can in fact tell you that I find the odor of this planet to be unpleasant,"
Lex said measuredly. Ryuk let out a small chuckle. As he did, Blaine followed behind Lex.
"General,"
he said in his deep voice,
"request permission to accompany you."
"Permission granted," said Ryuk, "under the proviso that you only fire upon the humans at my request. No killing on sight. We don't know what condition they're in, and they may be salvageable."
"Understood,"
replied Blaine compliantly, although Ryuk had learned to tell when the Dalek was sulking.
"Sensors indicate that the human vessel impacted in this direction,"
Lex stated, and advanced past Ryuk. "Then let's go," he said. As Ryuk traversed along the rocky terrain, he stepped carefully. The lighter gravity was slightly disorienting, but not too much. He was careful and disciplined. Watching his footwork was second nature to him. And if it became too much of a chore, well, he could always fly, he thought to himself. His wings were currently tucked away, but a slight breeze blew them so they billowed subtly like a cloak. Lex and Blaine were using their anti-gravity drives to hover over the ground, to avoid the unevenness, although at one point, Blaine hit a jagged edge and muttered something that sounded a lot like swearing.
"This is the impact zone of one segment of the ship. There are multiple sections of debris and other areas separated during the crash,"
Lex declared. Ryuk looked at the debris. It was still aflame. The smell was worse in this area. Again, he thought, the sulfur. "Looks like I was right to tell you to hold your fire, Blaine. I don't think a weapons discharge would sit healthily with this planetoid's atmospheric composition. There's hydrogen in the atmosphere as well as sulfur. Hydrogen sulfide, highly flammable, Ryuk said. Blaine didn't even reply, still sulking. Ryuk comforted himself with a tap of his sword holster. He never knew when he'd need it. Today, he just might.
Scanners detect that a human was here but has moved,
Lex stated. His eye entered infrared mode, and he noted a set of footprints. But they were not human footprints. They looked more like some kind of animal paw prints.
The tracks leading away from the area are not human.
Not human, repeated Ryuk. Interesting. We must follow the tracks,
Agreed. They lead in this direction.
Lex replied, and led the way towards a cave-like structure. Interesting, and perhaps dangerous. Blaine, guard the cave entrance, he ordered.
I obey,
Blaine stated. All sulking dropped. Though they sometimes shared banter, one did not hesitate in following the general's direct orders. Blaine revolved and positioned himself at the cave mouth as Ryuk and Lex entered. Lex continued to follow the tracks in infrared, and Ryuk tapped a finger against his visor, and a small light activated, illuminating his way. Meanwhile, Bolt and Anna were still hiding in their ditch. Bolt was pacing. He hated doing nothing, but there wasn't much to do. An idea struck him.
Anna, if we could make our way to where the aft part of the ship crashed, we could get hold of some firearms, he suggested.
We brought them in case of emergency. This does rather describe the situation, Annabelle replied. Suddenly, they heard a howl, and looked at each other cautiously. What was that? Anna asked warily.
Yeah, I heard that earlier,
Andrew said simply. And you didn't think to tell me? She asked. Bolt shrugged nonchalantly.
I didn't want to worry you unduly, he said.
If there's an unidentified life form on this planet between us and the Daleks, I'd hardly call it unduly, she said. Well, if the ship crashed facing west, then we came from the east. So the rear of the ship will be eastward. Stands to reason, she deduced.
Can't argue with that,
said Bolt. He held a hand out to her and she took it, standing. She still felt unsteady.
Don't worry, you can lean on me.
Thanks, but I'll be fine, she said coldly. Though she found his concern flattering, she did not want him to think of her as weak. She could handle herself. She hadn't been a 10-year veteran of the Eden military without being able to do so by herself. They began to walk, but Bolt suddenly stopped. What is it? What's wrong? Anna asked. After she did, she heard a growl, a very close one, coming from right behind them. They both slowly turned and found themselves face to face with what can only be described as a beast. It was wolf-like, with all the biological features of one, but it was more human. It stood upright, like a man, and its eyes glowed in the light from the stars above. It smiled a fanged smile. I think we should run, Anna said.